Today we are interviewing Mary Whisner, who since 1988 has been the reference librarian at the University of Washington Gallagher Law Library. I should also note that Mary was the head of reference from 1991 until 1999, when she became the assistant law librarian for reference services, a position she held until 2006. Mary, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us where you were raised and about your life both when you were young and today?
Sure. I was raised in a suburb of Seattle and went to high school here and went to the University of Washington. And now, many years later, I'm at the University of Washington, living just a little bit closer to the UW than I grew up.
Got a little tired of the longer commute, I imagine?
Well, it's just nicer being in the city than being in my suburb.
Yeah. Well, I drove in this morning from my home in Olympia, which is about 50 miles south of Seattle. I know you know it, but our viewers might not. And I did have to contend, even though I came in after the rush hour, there was still a fair amount of traffic out there. And I can understand one wanting to be perhaps a bit closer to where one works, if possible, these days.
Well, the region has certainly grown a lot. When you were young, when I was young, Seattle was a little provincial. We had Boeing representing us to the world, but not much else. And now we've got Starbucks and Microsoft, Nordstrom, Boeing still, but we're much more cosmopolitan and we have a lot more people on the freeway.
Well, I can attest to that because I lived elsewhere for over 40 years and then moved back to this area a few years back. And it's considerably more crowded today, and but that's progress, and you see it other places as well. You mentioned being around the University of Washington. Could we speak briefly about your educational and professional training and background?
Sure.
Talk about where you got that.
I was an undergraduate here at the UW, and I majored in philosophy. And I didn't actually declare a major until well into my junior year. I was interested in a lot of things, didn't really feel committed to any one particular field, and then at some point I thought, I'm going to want to get a degree. Where do I seem to have a lot of credits? Philosophy is not remarkably practical, but I was interested in it. After I graduated, I worked as a secretary in the philosophy department. And then I figured I needed to do something else. I was a little bit at loose ends. I considered the library school. I considered getting a teaching certificate. Somebody told me that law school was interesting and had the potential for worthwhile work. So I took the LSAT and applied to law school. In retrospect, I think I didn't plan very well. I didn't have much idea of what lawyers did. I just thought, well, law school could be interesting. And so off I went. I went across the country to Harvard Law School, which was interesting for me developmentally in so many ways. One, it was a pretty intensive educational experience. Another is that it was the first time that I had been away from Seattle for more than 30 days in a row. And that's a good part of growing up. After 3 years of law jobs, I made the switch to law librarianship, and I ended up getting my library degree at Louisiana State University.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. When I was in library school, I too went to Harvard, but only for a month. In those days, I was here at the University of Washington in Marion Gallagher's program. And in those days, we had a 4-week fieldwork experience built into the curriculum. And she sent me to Harvard to do it under Earl Borgeson, who was the librarian at the time there. And it was an interesting change. I had never really been east. And Boston was nice. Fortunately, the weather was turning spring-like and not so much winter-like, as this was March in those days. But it was a nice experience, and I believe I enjoyed it for the brief time I was there. And it was fascinating to be around such a huge library and the scholarly mix. I mean, you walk down the faculty office row and there are the names on the doors, the same ones in our card catalogs in those days. They were prolific authors, many of them. I noticed after you graduated from Harvard that you clerked for Judge Seymour of the 10th Circuit for a while. And then you worked in Washington, D.C., of all places, which is a nice place to work, since I did that myself for 30 years. You worked for the National Labor Relations Board. And after that, you became an attorney fellow, as it says in your resume, for the Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship Program. Then after the real world of being a lawyer, you decided to become a law librarian. Could you talk a little bit about how you decided to make that switch and become a member of our profession? And did anyone play a role in that as a mentor or anything?
Yeah, many people played roles. One is that when I was a first-year law student at Harvard, I attended the lectures on legal research by Bob Baring, who was then the deputy law librarian. And I thought his discussions of the structure of legal information and legal publishing were really interesting. I thought he was an interesting and witty man, and I looked up his profile and I saw that he had both a law degree and a library degree, and I filed that away. Later, when I was an editor of a journal and we had a plagiarism issue, we talked to Bob Baring, and again, it was just a little seed planted. Hey, here's an interesting guy who does interesting stuff. Well, then time passes. When I had a Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship, it was a combination of litigation. I was placed with a public interest group called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and events at Georgetown. The fellows got together for a luncheon once a month and a seminar once a month, and we were also allowed to audit classes at Georgetown, and I audited Gender in the Law and Women's Legal History. And during that year, I realized that I was enjoying the academic side much more than I enjoyed the work I was doing in the public interest group. I really believed in the mission of the public interest law and the women's legal rights and anti-discrimination and working for civil rights, but I didn't like the work and I didn't like some of the stresses that I faced. Meanwhile, I thought it was really interesting to talk to people in academia. So I began talking about what my next step would be. And one of the professors at Georgetown suggested that I talk to a Georgetown reference librarian named Patty Tobin. I had lunch with her, and she seemed very enthusiastic about being a reference librarian. I thought, that'd be interesting. A friend of mine was a lawyer at the Department of Justice and introduced me to Kathy Larson, who was the librarian for the Civil Rights Division. She seemed interesting. At that time, I knew I was going to be moving to Louisiana to follow the person I was living with, and Kathy Larson wrote down on a piece of paper Stella Chang, who was the director at Loyola, and Lance Dixon, who was the director at LSU, and I ended up working for both of them. I was up at Boston for a conference that spring, and I stopped by Harvard to chat with people. I talked to a staff person I knew and said I was thinking about librarianship, and she suggested I talk to Joan Shear, who at the time was a reference librarian at Harvard and had been a law student at Harvard. And she was also very enthusiastic about the work. And the more I talked to people, the more I thought, yeah, this is something I could do and enjoy. So then when I was preparing to move to Louisiana, my partner at the time had a job at Tulane. I made an appointment and went in to talk to Stella Chang, gave her my resume, and it happened that she was beginning to plan a library move because Loyola was moving from one part of the campus to some new buildings that the university had acquired. And she said, she was thinking of hiring a library student to help organize this, but I was there, would I be interested in working? And I was like, you bet. So I was able to work at Loyola for some months, get a taste of librarianship. Planning a move is a great way to learn everything in the library. And then they kept me on for a few months as a reference assistant. And that gave me enough of a taste that when I applied to library school, I had a good idea of what I was getting into, as opposed to when I applied to law school and I was very vague on what lawyers did.
Well, I find it fascinating to hear the names you have mentioned, people who played a role basically in helping you to focus on coming into our field. I guess it was a small world because I know all of them.
Yeah.
And they're wonderful people. Did a lot with Patty Tobin in the D.C. area over the years, and she was particularly a lot of fun to be around.
One other I should mention is that when I was in D.C., Kathy Larson said that I should talk to the incoming president of the Law Librarian Society of the District of Columbia, who was Penny Hazelton, who was then the head of research at the Supreme Court Library. And I telephoned her, and years later I found the notes I made on scratch paper, and she told me that law librarianship was a good field. I would need to get a library degree. Not everyone liked library school, but I would need to get it. Mm-hmm. So that was one other influence, and of course I've worked for her for 25 years now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Penny as the incoming president or president-elect of the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C. She never actually served.
Right.
Because the opportunity to come back out here to Seattle and had the program that Marion had built and Bob Baring had briefly for a few years when he was here, was, I guess, just too big an opportunity. So she turned down being our president back there. But
and just a month or two after we spoke on the phone was when she moved out to Seattle.
Yeah. And so, as you say, it's a small world in our field in many ways. Actually, Mary, you have served the profession in an awful lot of very important and relatively diverse ways, including being a member, of course, of AALL in at least 2 of its chapters, including the Law Librarians of Puget Sound. Your CV, or curriculum vitae, shows that you have been very active in these chapters and associations, and are also a prolific and accomplished author. I believe many of our viewers of this video will recognize you primarily from your regular columns in the Law Library Journal entitled Practicing Reference that have appeared there for a number of years. Actually, I think you started it back in about 1999.
Yes.
Way back in the last century.
That's right.
You are also the author of one of the AALL publication series books, Practicing Reference, Thoughts for Librarians and Legal Researchers. And this has been recognized, along with your co-authors, for writing the Washington's Legal Researchers Desk Book, for which you have received AALL's most prestigious Publications Award, the Joseph L. Andrews Bibliographical Award. Would you like to talk a little bit about your own scholarship, but perhaps also focus on why you think it's important for librarians to engage in this sort of activity?
Well, sure. To me, the writing has come out of other things that I've done. For instance, the Washington Legal Researchers Desk Book grew out of a CLE. At the University of Washington, under Penny Hazelton's leadership, we formed a full-day CLE on Washington legal research, and we had units on, statutes and basic primary sources, administrative law research, practice materials, online research, legislative history, and so on. And the CLE was fairly successful, and then we said, let's take those materials and make them into a book, which we did. So it started off with, in a way, the reference function becomes the teaching function, becomes the writing function. My column for Law Library Journal grew out of sort of my conversations online. In the early years of Law Lib, everybody would be on the email discussion list, posing questions, answering questions, and I tended to, sometimes when a question grabbed me, I'd write 3 or 4 paragraphs and really get into it. Seeing that, Frank Hodek, the editor of Law Library Journal, thought, maybe this woman could turn that writing into a column. I didn't come up with the column idea myself, Frank did. He called me and I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a try. And then it turns out that that is a genre that's very comfortable for me. I like the personal essay, nerdy exposition of legal sources, thoughts on law librarianship. It's just right for me. I don't believe that everyone needs to write or that everyone needs to write in the same way. I think, if people are interested, it's great. It's important that some people are sharing information, but people have many different strengths. I've learned that one of my weaknesses is leadership. I'm not really very good at organizing a committee or doing, managing agendas, keeping everyone on task. So for Law Librarians of Puget Sound, I have chaired a committee a couple of times, and then I learned to say, I'll serve on a committee, don't ask me to chair. It's just not my strength. Some of my colleagues are much better at that. They're organized, they understand how to get other people to do things, how to follow schedules, and so some of them have done more of that. They write some, not as much as I do, but that's the way they serve the profession.
I think that's very well put, because in looking around at all the colleagues that I've known over the years, including many with whom I'd worked at American University, not all of them are writers, but there are other contributions that they can make, and collectively we sort of complement each other, and that's you get wonderful outcomes, and that I think is very, very important to note. I think as we sort of near the end of this interview, I want to give you sort of the last word, Mary. Is there anything particularly you'd like to say or talk about before we conclude the interview?
I'd like to just herald the great diversity in our profession and the different people who make important contributions in all the different ways. The extroverts, the introverts, the writers, the speakers, the organizers, the worker bees, the racehorses, the workhorses. We're all working together, and in a well-functioning organization or a well-functioning chapter or a well-functioning committee, we need a lot of this.
And the same thing in our own libraries.
That's right.
You work here at the University of Washington, Gallagher Law Library. You have a tremendous group of colleagues.
Yes.
And yet there's a lot of work, and everyone has their, I'm sure, areas that they're more comfortable with, that they take care of, and others take care of other things.
Yes, and let me mention that one thing we do here is that we get to work with the law librarianship students. We have the information school offers an MLIS with a certificate in law librarianship, and the students work here as interns. And I've worked with them for the whole 25 years I've been here, and I see they come in with all sorts of interests and strengths. And one of them will be techie, and one of them will be extroverted. And I see their strengths working in different ways. And that one student might say, oh, I'm not exactly like this person, and that's okay. Sometimes an extroverted person is great in the reference office because that person is going out saying, come on in, I'd love to chat with you. But sometimes a more reserved person is great in the reference office because patrons who are nervous about an unknown field, a little bit anxious, they like the calm and the matter-of-fact orderliness of that more reserved person. And I've learned that, many different personality styles among our interns can be very successful.
Well, that is a interesting observation, one that I share completely with you. And I imagine it has been tremendously good to be able to meet all these new, shall I say, converts to the profession, the students in Fanny's program over these years, and run into them from time to time at meetings. And it's got to be a very pleasurable experience. Well, maybe on that note, I want to thank you for taking some time this morning here in the conference room in the Gallagher Law Library and talking about yourself and our profession and the people in our profession. That's exactly what we hope to be able to bring out in these various history interviews that we're doing. Yeah. Thank you,
Pat.
Mary Whisner.